Welcome to another edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. My name is Jamal Bynum. I'm the chair of the MORE Board of Directors. MORE stands for Movement in Omaha for Race Equity. It's been around for over 10 years, and we've been doing some strong anti-racism race work, more so in the last 3 to 4 years. And so one of our agendas is to, from time to time, have various people in the community come and talk to us about various topics and interests of the day related to race, anti-racism, and just issues that we need to be about to discuss in our communities. And we hope that this will be an opportunity for us to explore those issues with many folks. Today, I have with me in the studio, or as we say in our Zoom and our Facebook Live, Paul Feilmann, and this is not his first rodeo with us, but he's been involved in social justice issues and initiative to bring attention to issues impacting communities of color. I met Paul a number of years ago when he was involved at the First United Methodist Church, where he came to a number of our meetings and contributed and participated in some of those discussions. Paul also participated in sitting at the governor's mansion for a number of weeks, where he was raising awareness level about the horrific conditions in the Nebraska Department of Corrections, meaning the prison system. He also did what we call a one-person sit-in at Douglas County Civic Center, bringing attention about various issues related to poverty, and he brought some attention to our county as well as our city officials, and had a chance to talk to him about some of that here in Douglas County as well as in Omaha, Nebraska. Most of the things he does is things that nonprofits should be doing, and some of them are not doing, and particularly some of these social service agencies. So Paul's been doing some of these things because, again, their mission speaks to it. But again, Paul is a one-person operation doing these things. But we got to get him a little bit more on that mothership to help us do more within our community agencies. We invited Paul on to talk a little bit more about his endeavors, but also he's been very much involved in reparations, reconciliation. He studied a great deal about what happened in the Jewish Holocaust, and he saw some parallels of what is happening to African Americans in the United States in terms of our history and so on. So he's been working on that issue, and we have some events coming up in the future where Paul's going to be involved in those activities and so on. So we've asked him here to share some of his observations, what he's working on, and help us to kind of get more people involved in many of these activities. Paul, welcome to Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. We know that you've been involved in this for a while, and it's rare to find white folks who take such initiatives, working on volunteering on anti-racism, particularly in this community. So we're kind of really happy that you're able to join us. But first, tell the viewers a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll get right into our questions. We have a number of questions. And folks, the format tonight is I'm going to kind of interview Paul for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to throw it open and let you ask him direct questions, either through Facebook Live, the chat, and so on. So, and also we will record this event, and hopefully we'll post it on our Facebook for those individuals who will not get a chance to maybe hear this as it's live. So, Paul, first a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll get into our questions.
Yeah, my name is Paul Feilmann, and I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. Went to Iowa State, moved to Omaha about 40 years ago, and raised family. My wife and I raised 5 kids, working on 7th grandkid right now, and did a mental health counseling for about 25 years as a marriage and family counselor, then transitioned into driving for UPS so I could get a retirement pension, and retired from there about 5 years ago, and then been involved in community activism since then.
The other thing, Paul, I want to say is many of the viewers do not necessarily some of the things you've been working on in terms of anti-racism and reparation issues. Tell us a little bit more about what that's been about for you. What's that all about, and what are you doing in that whole area?
Basically, been looking at the health of the community. I call myself a community advocate. Factors that I look at that are indicators of problems with the health of the community usually have to do with health, housing, things that fall under the category of poverty, exposure to violence, substance abuse, those kinds of things. The prevalence of those things, what tends to fuel those things, what tends to eliminate those things. That's kind of what I've spent the last few years looking at, and it's led me into several directions to explore those issues and learn from people and collaborate with people. Different organizations and different individuals in the community, different parts of the community, and also in Lincoln and parts of Nebraska as well.
Mhm. You know, one of the over the few months I've been challenging and seeing many of these nonprofits, organizations, so on, who don't necessarily have diverse groups on their board of directors or their staff, but yet they work in North Omaha. They work for their mission relates to serving people of color and low income and so on. Many of these boards have all white boards, and they also have leadership teams that are predominantly all white or sometimes one gender. And one of our concerns is what advice can we offer to folks to give them to be involved more in integration, some of the issues you've been working on, but also direct racial agendas, and particularly this reparation issue, because I know that's a challenging one for many people. But how do you help people to get more involved in those kind of efforts, particularly when they come from those enclaves that tend to be white supremacists or all white environments in our nonprofits in our community? How would you talk to them, or what would you say to them?
The history in the community, and I think in the United States, Malcolm, or not Malcolm X, but Martin Luther King talks about the other America. There's two Americas, the one that's living in prosperity and things are going really well, and then the other part that lives with racism and poverty, and those two parts. And the racial differences between those two are fairly significant. High preponderance of white European folks on the prosperity side, and then in the area affected by poverty, you have people of color, but a large percentage of those, or a significant percentage of those, is African Americans. And crossing the social boundaries to develop relationships, I think, is one of the biggest failures that's allowed the current racism trauma to occur in parts of our community. And I think you and I had talked about the movie A Time for Burning, where the church tried to bridge that gap by having members of a Black church come and spend time and get to know people in the white church. And that's the kind of thing that I'm looking at trying to promote, especially across different religious organizations who have values around reconciliation and repentance and atonement for issues around any particular issue, but in particular regarding racism. The Jewish community, I've reached out to them. They're very interested in having some outreach and building relationships across racial boundaries. Once I think you develop empathy, then you can begin to repair relationships by repairing damage that was done through racism in the community.
Mhm. Paul, historically, we live in a city that has a long history of redlining, and some people don't even know what that word means. But basically, the issue of where you would not allow your house to be sold to people of different racial groups, particularly African Americans. There's a project called Divisible. I think it's showing out at UNO, and it's gotten a lot of publicity locally. What do you think about those efforts to reverse or deal with historical redlining in Omaha, and how does that relate to your quest of dealing with reparations and reconciliation, this redlining agenda?
The there's a couple things. First, I did some reading of. There's a woman who's actually, in my background, is Ashkenazi Jew. It's a racial line from Europe, and she is actually from that line. She moved to the United States, or her family moved to the United States a few generations ago, and was granted land up in South Dakota. She was able to. Their family then developed wealth up there. And she began looking at her family history. She realized that the land that her family was given was taken away from a racial group that's known as the indigenous population. And she wrote a book that's coming out. It's called The Cost of Free Land. And she's looking at giving back the land that her family took from the indigenous population, and looking at how she spent a lot of time over the last couple of years writing this book and learning about how the theft of land from the indigenous population did severe damage to their culture and to their overall well-being. And she's trying to use her learnings from the Jewish faith, which is, there's some teachings from the Jewish faith that talk about the 6 steps to repentance. And I think they're worth noting because it just goes fairly straightforward. The first one is stop doing the harm. Second is confess as specifically as possible what harm you've caused, and ideally say this truth out loud in public. Third, begin the work of transforming yourself from a person capable of such harm to one who is not. Fourth is make restitution that reflects the size of the harm, repairing the harm. Fifth is apologize in a way that doesn't necessitate or anticipate being forgiven, but makes clear to the victim that you have heard them and that you understand that you have caused them pain. And finally, when you have the opportunity to cause the same sort of harm again, make different choices. And that's, I think, what I'm trying to look at. The harm that's been done in North Omaha, you mentioned the movie Divisible. That's hard to see right now. It's not out for public release, but there's a very comparable movie that's filmed by public television out of Minnesota. It's called Jim Crow of the North. And it parallels exactly the racism past of Minneapolis, and the parallels between what's been done to African Americans through racism in Minneapolis are very similar to what the history in North Omaha is.
Mhm. Wow. One of the things we like to do is continue to bring attention to those folks who are working on anti-racism and race equity issues, because there's not that many organizations in Omaha who actually do that in an overt way and so on. Which brings to another point. I had a chance to talk to the Urban League director recently, and he said there are 3 issues they're working on down the road. I'm not sure if it's now, but he did mention the concept of reparations, home ownership, and entrepreneurship for people having business and so on. He said those are the 3 things that he thinks that are central to help dealing with that. But one of the questions I would challenge him, and I've challenged others, is where are we at then in terms of trying to make that happen, to put feet under those kind of concepts? Because I think they're 3 good, excellent points. But again, if we don't have activities to back it up or deal with it, it becomes more abstract. I want to switch up a little bit, and I want to talk to you a little bit about your work in the prison. And we haven't talked about that earlier, but you spend a lot of time working with the prison industry, the prison industrial complex. You and I had a discussion about, I think you were behind some of the increases in the guards getting some extra income, because you advocated that if they had better incomes, they would be higher level professional guards and do a better job. But my question is, what is your success in dealing with the prison industry complex in Nebraska? How do you measure that, or how do you surmise what has happened, considering all the advocacy and things that you've done in that area, Paul?
The history of the prison system in Nebraska, as far as racism is concerned, is deplorable. The statistics just came out yesterday in the new report. It shows that 5% of the population in the state of Nebraska is Black, and 28% of the prison population is Black. And it's incarceration. Mass incarceration has been a historical part of racism in the United States, even right after slavery, when they had to release folks that were impacted by slavery. They then found ways to incarcerate them and put them back on the same plantations. And it's just been a continual way to disenfranchise that racial group, because they're seen as inferior. And now you've got a very significant disproportionate number of people in prison and from the African American community, and there's not adequate resources or support put there. So you have a massive overcrowding condition that's become very dangerous. There was 2 severe riots in 2015 and 2017 where lives were lost, and there's major fires and so forth. And there's also some deplorable conditions going on in the prisons to this day. There's still a major use of solitary confinement, which is seen to be torture if you use it for more than 15 days, but it's been used. There was an article yesterday about 2 guys that are going to discharge into the community after being in solitary confinement out in Nebraska prisons for 5 years.
Wow.
And kind of damage that's done. I've worked with senators to try and get some restrictions put on the use. We passed some legislation a few years ago to restrict the use of solitary confinement for vulnerable populations, but they're still abusing that. And the conditions in the prisons are still some of the most overcrowded in the country. So they can't do rehabilitation. They aren't willing to make sentencing reforms because of the fear of safety. So you have just this kind of continuing cycle of incarceration that's traumatizing African American population very disproportionately.
By the way, most people don't know what solitary confinement means in prison in Nebraska. Do they have people in a hole in the ground? Are they in their cells all day locked in? What does that mean when you use the word solitary confinement in a prison industrial complex such as Nebraska?
basically, they don't, Nebraska likes to use the definition of 24 hours with no human contact to consider it solitary confinement. So they don't call it solitary confinement. They say they don't use it because it's not 24 hours, it's 23 hours. And basically you'll be in a very small cell with no human interaction from anybody. And you'll get out 1 hour a day in a very restricted dog pen sort of environment that's outdoors sometimes, and to get some sunshine or to get some fresh air, and then you'll be back in that cell. It's very debilitating. There's a movie called Last Days of Solitary. Frontline PBS shows the realities of what the Inspector General has said is what we do in solitary confinement in the state of Nebraska. And it's called the Last Days of Solitary. It's really important to watch if you want to understand the trauma to people incarcerated in isolation.
Wow. The reason I spent a little time on that, and I wanted to ask about that, because I do know we have school to prison pipeline that happens in our local school districts. We got a number of police officers who sometimes facilitate this smooth transition from school to prison by some of the things they do. Some people get out or get some benefits when they go through the judicial system, but there's something wrong. We got disproportionate numbers of like triple or 10 times other groups in other states. By the way, do we have any really good correctional institutions in this country that you can allude to, Paul, that this state should be looking at? Is there any good places? Because I do know different types, but do you know any that could help us to get better? Anything jump out at?
I think Colorado has been the leader in a lot of the work, and there's other organizations. I'm not up to speed on all those right now. ACLU tends to advocate for changing the mass incarceration, following their work. But the state of Colorado tends to be very progressive in terms of the work they're doing over there.
Yeah. One of the things, if you had to describe one of your most painful or challenging experiences doing your work, dealing with anti-racism, what would that be, and particularly as a white guy? I mean, oftentimes I don't see a lot of white folks explain or talk about their anti-racism work, but how would you describe yours as? And I don't necessarily know what that is, obviously, but share that with our participants.
Yeah, you and I talked before when in some of my work, the lack of sensitivity to the impact of racism in the Black and African American community. I consider myself kind of like very insensitive at times, and I used the N-word publicly one time in describing. I was quoting somebody in a trial where there was some severe racism, and I actually said the N-word and did not appreciate the severe impact that has to people that have been traumatized by racism. And I've spent a lot of time trying to repair the damage done by that. That's probably the most significant lesson I've learned about the severity of the trauma that's occurred, and how you need to really be respectful and careful about how you work in this area.
One of the things I know that we've talked about in the title of our presentations on what is great white saviorism or social justice reparation. From your vantage point, how would you distinguish that concept? In other words, how do you avoid being a great white savior versus someone who's doing some social justice work with the respective groups, racial groups that you're working with? How would you describe that from your vantage point?
Primarily trying to build relationships and empower people to set goals and to accomplish things that will reduce racism in the community. And I try and build those relationships wherever I can. I've got several with the correction system. I've got several with the legislature. I'm building relationships with religious organizations. Any organization that I can build a connection with, I try to do that. I attend meetings every week where there's a number of organizations working on addressing youth violence and so forth in the community, which I consider part of this effort to reduce the impact of racism. But that's how I see my efforts. Trying to work with those folks and empower people to have input. People impacted by racism, I think, should have the leadership in determining what would be helpful to repair the damage that's been done and getting that.
Quick question. How much are you being paid for doing this work? Are you on somebody's payroll or what? Talk to me about that.
I only get paid for my charm and good looks, which is very little.
One of the things that I challenge folks is that sometimes those of us who are retired or volunteers do more work than people who got full salaries, and some of them got six-figure salaries. You wonder what are they doing, standing around the water cooler all day. One question.
Well,
Go ahead.
well, I will say it is a challenge. I'm very fortunate to have the time to go out and build relationships because I have the time. Our society is so caught up with, your own little bubble, keeping everybody in your family and your bubble, in prosperity, that they don't have time to look beyond that. And I've had the time to do that. And the goal is to try and help more people be able to do that through whatever organizations can do that. I'm hoping that through churches and the values around different church organizations, we can build bridges with the African American community to start address the damages from racism.
Got you. Have you considered working with the traditional nonprofits such as Habitat for Humanity or the Community Alliance, Legal Aid Nebraska, Family Service, or Urban League? Have you thought about working with them in a more formal setting?
I try to connect with them wherever I can. And that basically is a continued process. And I look for connections that allow me to facilitate opportunities to talk with people. And right now, the Empowerment Network has a meeting with 50 to 100 people every week. And I look for opportunities to introduce myself and collaborate with people there, and as well as other parts of the community, and especially in the African American community.
Good, good. We're getting closer to the end before we're going to open up. But I just want to ask you, I know you and I have talked extensively about reading books. We have a book on our webpage that we ask people to read, Decolonializing Wealth, written by a Native American, and we like people to do that. But one of the questions I have for you, since you've introduced me to some books that I was not familiar with, is you read a lot of books, Paul. What are your top three, or how can you help us understand the social and racial issues, and particularly through your book? So talk to us a little bit about the books you find interesting, but books that can help us deal with some of these racial and social issues.
I think in terms of racism and the African American community and how it's impacted them, the two authors that I read or have read repeatedly is Malcolm X, and books about Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. I think that his books and his speeches are particularly insightful. And then the other ones that I look at have to do with, I've looked at my family history of racism impacting the Jewish community. And my father, you and I have talked about my dad passing away in April, but he was 97, and he taught me a lot about what it was like being ostracized as someone of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage in Hamburg growing up, and they were able to escape, but just barely. And the other book that I've been looking at too is called Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto. It basically chronicles the development of the Warsaw Ghetto and how everybody from a genetic line or racial line was segregated into that, and then allowed to basically just suffer and eventually be moved towards genocide out of that ghetto. And it seems to have great parallels with what we've done in the African American community in Omaha, but our lack of awareness of that is pretty astounding.
You share that one of the things that I think happens in terms of genocide and some of these atrocities that have happened historically is that we ostracize people, or we demonize them, or we also don't allow them in our circles. And so when I look at some of these white supremacy organizations or individuals who practice it in a covert manner, my point is, how come you don't have the diverse people when we live in a diverse city or a diverse society? And so at some point, they're so far removed that they don't even have conversations related to that, but also it goes back to history. So if you understand how these things have transpired, then we get into some of that into those situations. We're kind of like at the end where we're getting ready to open this up a little bit, but I want to ask you, Paul, if somebody want to catch up with you or talk to you, what's the best way to catch up with you or track you down in terms of where you hang out at, as we would say?
I do all my work on Facebook. I'm on Twitter as well, but I'm on Facebook. That's where you can reach me on Messenger, or you can email me at Feilmann, Feilmann @iCloud.com.
Okay, good. Well, we were a little bit earlier. I guess we you know how we have to, as they call it, audible. We're going to open it up for folks, and I know we got some people who are some participants of our past event. I saw we got a couple of chats that came in. But anyone want to ask Paul a question directly or comment or share some of their experience related to anti-racism or race issues? This is where we're at today. And we're talking our topics about reparations and issues related to white saviorism, but also how do you get more people involved in dealing with some of the social justice issues that we deal with related to reconciliation or repentance and so on, as we've outlined. So questions, comments, so on. Oh, I see your hands up, Cynthia. Yeah.
I just thought I'd do the hand raise thing. Okay. As I listened to you, Paul, I was remembering conversations with my GED students who were from Africa, and recently with one of those working with English language learners from other parts of Africa. Their experience of our white supremacy race issues is like, how do you say? He doesn't look at it at all like how the people of the United States do. It's like it's our issue here. And that experience of the Black, which meaning the history is slavery in that family, the Black history as compared to our new African Americans. It seems like that all our effort at restitution, reconciliation, repentance, it's like it's a puzzle to some of these. And I just wondered if you had any experience with the African.
Yeah, I think that I listened, like you said, I listened to Martin Luther King a lot, and he talks about the other America, and he includes a lot of different racial groups in that. But he said that because of the history of slavery in the United States, people that have been through that have got much more trauma and impact from the racism, or that idea that the very being of that person is what he calls inferior or defective, and that experience is heavily weighted around folks that have been through the slavery experience, came here as slaves, and then that whole history that the United States, through lynchings, segregation, mass incarceration, that whole group of people are more heavily impacted by all that. He said that racism still affects other groups, Hispanics, Irish, other groups, but the ones that are the most severely impacted are African Americans. And they can't hide the fact that they're African American either. I mean, the skin color is obviously clearly a major factor that some people look at in terms of racism.
It's one of the persons I just noticed that made a point, going back, Paul, to your point of the transition, those people out of solitary, they said that there was no transition. So what would a transition look like getting out of solitary confinement? You mean they're in solitary confinement and you release them back into the community? I was unclear with that way that's laid out. What does that mean?
Nico Jenkins was a classic case. He'd been in solitary confinement for, I think, 8 or 9 years, and developed a severe psychosis and was having delusions, and voices were telling him to kill people. And he told the administration in the prisons that when he got out, he would not be able to stop himself from following these delusions. And so they didn't want to deal with him anymore. So they just released him straight. He was supposed to be committed to a mental health facility. He wanted to be transferred to a mental health facility instead of just discharged into the community. But the state didn't feel that they wanted to deal with him. So they just basically ignored some of the recommendations of psychiatrists and sent him out into the community. And he killed 4 different people randomly around the community.
Wow. Yeah, some people don't know that the Department of Corrections is backwards, and there's just some things they just don't do. I didn't know till recently they have no access to the internet like other states, or get some of the degrees like other states in doing that. So, and again, it disproportionately impacts African Americans, and we have a high percentage going into these post-secondary education called the Nebraska Correctional System. And again, we got these local law enforcement judicial systems who play right into making these numbers disproportionate as they are. Other questions, other comments for Paul related to the topic or whatever, things that he's working on related to racial justice and social justice issues? Yes, Louise.
Oh, I live in Lincoln, and I don't know if you've heard of something called, we're calling it Justice in Action.
Mhm.
And it's the DART organization that works with different cities around the United States. And the idea is that you get churches involved, as many churches as you can. And that power is money or it's people. And that if you, rather than churches just doing as they do so much charity work where they're being merciful, this idea is that you get so many voices that are asking for some kind of justice,
Hmm.
a major change, not just helping by providing food or whatever. And it's been going on for a year here in Lincoln. And what you do is you have these house meetings and people say what keeps them up at night, what do they think their community needs, and then they vote on. They narrow it down to two, and we narrowed it down to mental health and criminal justice reform. And then you have people that research, or by research, they call in all these people that deal with criminal justice or deal with mental health. That's their job. And they try to get a handle on the situation, which is really difficult to do. And I've been on the criminal justice, mostly listening in. It's not something I know a lot about, but I have learned a lot. And the two ideas we came up with, well, the most important one really was to expand the diversion programs. We have them, but they're not being used.
Mhm.
And you talked about sentence reform. We have a county attorney who's just throwing bail at everyone, no matter what their situation, what their crime, and being very particular about who can get into diversion. And so but I feel like we're trying to make change, but it's so slow.
Louise,
Very slow.
I'm going to ask you a question. Are there any people of color, racialized minorities in your church or in the groups that you're working with?
Well, that was the other thing I was going to say, was that we don't really have any Black churches that are members. There is a female minister who's African American at a church here in town, but I don't think it's predominantly Black. My church has very few. We have Sudanese
Okay.
who have their own services,
Right.
but they're not involved. So I feel like we're not getting the minorities involved like we should be.
Well, the reason I asked that because I know there's an anti-gun group in Lincoln, and they're all white. And when I asked the director about that, she kind of gave me a flippant answer that we had somebody, but there was no attention to bring different racial groups into the conversation. Some years ago, we were going to work with a couple of Methodist churches in Lincoln on anti-racism issues, and they also had the issue of sexual orientation, and they only want to go as to sexual orientation, but they want to deal with racism. They kind of nibbled a little bit, but at the end of the day, they were not interested. And so I find it amazing, some of these so-called faith-based organizations who talk about equality, justice, they have some of the same mentality that Martin Luther King talked about back in his day, where they want you to go slow and quiet, and some kind of way we haven't figured out how to do that. So that's, again, one of the challenges. How do we get the faith community more involved? Because, again, a lot of times they talk about feeding the poor, and that's it. But you often don't see someone visiting people who are in the prisons or jails and doing that kind of difficult work. Other questions, other feedback for Paul? Let's bring it back to Paul. Paul, any other comments from you, Paul?
Yeah, I wanted to just say that the religious organizations, I think, is really where I'm looking at trying to get some traction. The gal who just spoke, if you guys could look at the movie, if you Google A Time for Burning, are you familiar with that?
I don't think so.
Yeah, it basically shows the efforts in the 60s of a white church to basically encourage people from a Black church to come and spend time and getting to know each other. And they did it with the youth group, but when they tried to do it with the adults, it fell apart. And we're going to actually show that movie to some churches, and I'm reaching out to several organizations. One is the Jewish community. They're interested in building these relationships. Then the other one is the First Unitarian, the Creighton and the Catholic Church have got issues around slavery involvement back, a century ago. They used slaves to bail out their financial problems, so they're involved in these issues. But if you could maybe pass the word on to watch that movie, and then build. It kind of gives you the groundwork for, oh, okay. And there's actually a follow-up movie to that, which I can try and post a link on my Facebook, called A Time for Building. It shows, they took the movie all around the country and showed it to people. And it came down to the whole issue of racial segregation, how we're not willing to interact with people of this race, this other African-American race. And Martin Luther King talks about the whole issue of the very being of a person is inferior. That's the piece of race that we're talking about, and the damage that's been done to the African-American community over 300 years is all built up in the traumas that have occurred. And the only way you're going to understand that is to rebuild those relationships. So getting those relationships on a personal level, and if you want to know what the impact of those things has been, just ask people that are African-American, get to know their lives and the struggles that they have and how racism has affected their lives. They'll tell you. That's kind of what Ajmal and I are trying to do in Omaha.
Let me make a little clarification there. Most people don't know this, but the Time for Burning was done in Omaha at Augustine Lutheran Church. Senator Ernie Chambers at that time was a young barber. He was the star of the show, as well as Pastor Young Dog. So it was nominated for Academy Award. It was one of the documentaries back in 1966 or 65, and it didn't win, but it became a very powerful icon of what happens to a church that tries to do this back in 1966. And many times I've shown it in my classes in Black Studies, social work, and elsewhere. And students are shocked that we had not made much more progress. So, but the video is a very powerful film that shows Omaha and the climate, and the mayor speaks in it. But it again is close to home. It's done at 38th and Lafayette, and there's a lot of background to that movie. And we're going to show that clips of that with our Time for Building sometime later this year. So just stay tuned to our webpage, Facebook page, and we'll talk more about that. But yeah, it was done locally in Omaha, Nebraska, and put Nebraska on the map nationally back in 1966 or so on. Other feedback. I see we got some heavy hitters here who are quiet, and I'm not used to you being quiet. Some of the personalities, I'm not going to call on you. This is not a classroom, but anybody else want to raise some issues and deal with Paul directly? We try to be unfiltered. I see your lips moving, Tom. Are you trying to say something? Are you still on mute? I see you smiling. You're on mute, look like. Okay.
There we go. Yeah, sorry. One of the things I know that Paul and I, because we've been together for a number of years, and we read a couple of books early on that really opened my eyes to what's going on with the Black community. One is The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. And it was written by Michelle Alexander. And, what she said in the book, of course, is that all communities use drugs. White community uses drugs a lot more than Black communities, but because of the bills that came across, the incarceration of Black was astounding. And it's kind of the new Jim Crow. It's a way that we can keep people who are Black locked up. And so that was a book that really kind of opened our eyes. And then another book that we both read was Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And she compares the caste in India to the caste in the United States and how much worse it is here. So those two books really show that throughout the country, the white supremacists have basically been able to control the laws that have incarcerated Blacks and have put them in their place, and have made it difficult for them to get good jobs, have made it difficult for them to move, to gain wealth, all those. So those were two books early on that we both read that were like, oh my gosh. And Paul and I were actually volunteering in a school, Mount View, and one of the things that was fairly common was a lot of kids had parents that were incarcerated. So, reading that new Jim Crow certainly opened my eyes to what can happen, and a person who commits literally no crime at all can be incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And it talked in the book about you can literally be in a car with somebody who's doing something wrong and you have done nothing, and you're going to be incarcerated as well. So the book gave lots of examples of mass incarceration and how it has, created this private industry of, incarcerated prisons. And it was a very eye-opening book for me.
As you mentioned, Tom, and I find it fascinating because I actually heard that I knew that Michelle Alexander came to Omaha years ago,
Yes.
where she became extremely famous and one of the top speakers. And so I know that. And then I also saw Isabel Wilkerson out at the church Countryside some years ago, where she talked about her book, A Warmth of Another Sun. And this cast book came out afterwards. But what's wonderful about all three of these books is they're easy to read and understand, but they're also enlightening, and it can help people to understand some of the complexities of race and class and jails and prisons and youth and so on, yada, yada, yada. So I want to just deviate quickly. One of the things that, and I know this goes back to Tom, your point is that I did not know until later, and when I attended the 360 meeting, that they could arrest a youth in a car with another kid who had a gun. So if you didn't know your friend had a gun in the car, you can go to jail and get treated like you had the gun yourself. And so some of the anti-gun folks don't understand why some of our state senators, African Americans, support the open conceal law, because again, the police department have used that arbitrarily and racistly to put young kids in the juvenile justice system who obviously didn't know their friends were packing. And again, you can't help it in the way we treat guns in our society. You know, every time you look up, if you get caught with one or you're around one, unless you're a hunter, this kind of a draconian situation of dual justice in Nebraska. And so we got to talk about that more. I see someone else has got something to say here. We have about 20 minutes left or so on other feedback. Paul, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think that the key part is getting white people to get personally involved in understanding the trauma and the damage that's being done by the history of racism in the city of Omaha. And then once you develop that awareness and those relationships, then beginning to look at making major efforts to change that. Without the relationships, it just seems that it all becomes kind of a analysis paralysis is what Martin Luther King calls it. Analysis paralysis. And until it becomes personal, that's what we have to do in a time for building, is build those relationships. And I think the Jewish community is a good place to start, because they have the insights of what it was like to have genocide initiated against them just because of their race. And if you go to watch, just Google the Warsaw Ghetto and pull up any video that you think is interesting, and you can watch the history of the formation of the Warsaw Ghetto. It's actually a northern district in the city of Warsaw, which is parallel to the northern district in the city of Omaha that was walled off. In Omaha, it was walled off after the Will Brown lynching, and then maintained there by segregation. In Poland, they actually built a brick wall around it and enforced it. But the parallels between the two of them, but the only thing if we don't get people together, from different racial groups to talk about repairing the harm, and then we're not going to make any difference.
As you alluded to there, Paul, one of the things that I think sometimes I've asked some of my 7 white friends, it used to be 7, now it's down to 4, but I asked this question: can you name in one past year something you've done in the social justice dealing with anti-racism, race work for other people, where there was, you just did it out of the goodness of your heart? And you'll be surprised of those who can articulate one thing and some who have nothing. And so one of the questions I raise is, how do you do social justice work without doing it? Are you a paper tiger? And so again, we have a lot of press groups in our society, and what are we doing to lift our hands and fingers to reverse some of the quagmires in this racism? And again, talk about racial healing and reconciliation. Are we really doing the work? And are our institutions doing it? And again, we wouldn't have some of the problems we have today if we had more people involved. Other feedback, we got about 16, 17 more minutes. Other reactions, other feedback.
I want to affirm what Paul said about the white people must know what happened in the past, and we need to look at what's going on now. You mentioned building the wall, and for me, I think about the many walls that are either physical walls, electronic walls. Over in Palestine, a whole wall going around the territory that the settlers want. But back to the faith piece, which is part of what I thought I heard you talk about. I put names of 2 books that have recently put me face to face with my religious background, which is Catholic. And that's the book, All Oppression Shall Cease. I liked that book because it gave me the big picture of history and the law and the arguments about why it was just to have these enslavement issues or people enslaved. And the other book hit home closer because it's about Father Marcoux, who at age 23 in 1917 made a commitment to work for racial equity. We use that word. He used for racial, interracial. He wanted to do that black church, white church type of thing. So he would cross over into the red-lined area. And the story about Omaha is specifically 47 to his death in 67. But he and his brother kept being transferred around until the Jesuits woke up and said, oh, this is a just mercy issue, which brings me back, Louise, I thank you for bringing out the idea that it's justice that needs to be spoken about. And then people might move toward reconciliation, mercy, and that part. I just needed to point out that there are good books, and I just ordered 2 more, one of which is the warmth in the sun, no, warmth in the sun book. That one's coming. And then there's another one by forgot its name right now, begins with an A, but those 2 books are focusing me on Omaha. And when I give a tour of the facility where I'm living, and graduates of this high school who lived in the the Florence area say, I didn't know that there was a red line district in Omaha. And we're both graduated in like 66, 65, 3, that part of history. We could go to this Catholic high school and not know a thing about the redlining and the blacks. I mean, our white ignorance is astonishing me. So my goal is to continue with the education piece.
Good, thank you. Someone want to react? I heard some comment there. Was that you, Paul, or who?
Yeah, there. I think there is going to be a presentation about that priest that you just mentioned. I think it's on like the 30th of the month, and I can't remember the organization.
Oh, it's September 28th. If you're talking about an event on 24th Street.
Yes.
There's one September 28th, and it's I registered through whatever came to me. I think it was the Creighton Schlegel Center, because the author of the book, Matt Holland, who is the son of Lenny Holland, Matt wrote the book, and his dad was the one that worked very much with Father Marcoux with the De Porres Club. And all of the, when Marcoux died, all the paperwork and the letters, the family didn't know what to do with, because Marcoux is like, okay. So they gave it to Matt Holland, and that's where Matt got a lot of his information for that book, that biography. And those archival materials, as I understood it, is what's going on the 28th with the presentation and then the giving of those documents.
Yes.
Yeah, for that information. But yeah, the other book that is relevant to that is it's called 272. It's the number of slaves that Georgetown University sold to balance their books when they had financial.
Oh, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a book out about that. But I think that there is a justice and reconciliation effort through Creighton that needs to be built on and build more connections to this whole concept of atonement. And that's that whole concept that the Jewish faith has, and all Christian and all monotheistic faiths have, have issues or values about atonement and repentance. But no one, if you ever ask a Black person, I challenge you to ask a Black person that you know if Omaha has ever taken responsibility for the harm that they've caused to Black people in the last 100 years, and just see what they tell you. That's
say that to a white person.
What?
You say that to a white
Black person.
Say it to ask a Black person if Omaha's ever taken responsibility for the harm that was caused by racism. And
I think it's because white is ignorant.
Well, if you don't have relationships with people impacted by racism, then you're not going to understand it or empathize with it.
As you alluded to that, one of the things I do find somewhat harmful or painful is, as I show the time for burning, I'm surprised it's not utilized more in our local education university system, particularly Black studies. Again, Senator Chambers set the foundation for that. But I just think you got to look at the history to see where we're at today. And again, we have a high school named after Burke, who was a segregationist, apartheid, white supremacist. And again, like we have those Confederate signs going down in the South, and those people were involved in the wrong side of justice coming down. We should get rid of Burke High School in terms of its name. But the thing that I think is most alarming is that most people don't understand that before 1865, when many Africans were enslaved or blacks were enslaved, you got free land if you're white. And so you had this generational wealth that people have passed down, and we don't talk about that. So we look at folks who have been hijacked and been, ostracized and worked from sun up to sundown, and yet you don't hear people talk about free homesteading in Nebraska and elsewhere. And again, the issues, we got to also include Native Americans and Latinos and other groups who've been oppressed historically, and there's reparations and reconciliation. But basically, we're talking about enslavement here. But those are the conversations we have to have, and you can't have them if you don't understand the literature, understand the basic foundation of that. So yeah. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to get some other people who have been quiet on the sidelines. We have some bystanders and sideliners and all those others. So other folks who may want to share something.
I was going to ask you, Jamal, is there any movement at all about that school, about changing the name?
Sometimes I have to stop being cynical, because I know we have a number of folks who are conscious of it, but I don't see any groundswell, because again, a lot of our folks have been just hoodwinked or brainwashed or don't understand the history. As a matter of fact, I had a colleague one time who told me a story that when Harry Burke died, they had a celebration of Black teachers because they were happy how mean he was to Black folks. And I was a little surprised she shared that, but I don't remember them ever making a peep or doing anything about it. And I've raised it in certain circles, but there's not a groundswell because people are still stuck on some other agendas of the issues of the day that doesn't deal with those kind of issues. But you should not have a school named after a person who was so public about that. And most people don't understand that he didn't even hire Black folks. And so many African Americans who had teaching degrees from the university had to go to Iowa in order to teach. And so it was not until 1964, that they started to bring up a group of African Americans from Black colleges, and we started to get a little bit more dark faces in OPS. But OPS has a horrific history of racism, the segregation, the busing case. And Paul, to your point, I don't think the administration ever apologized how they segregated people, even though they were students, even though they were found guilty like a whining dog in court. So again, we have the same behaviors we need to talk about. But yeah, I just don't think, Louise, there's a movement, but hopefully at some point we'll get some cognitive folks, or at least some brain movement, so they can do that, because there's no way we should have that school named after Burke. There's many other great Omahans or Nebraskans we should name schools after, but not someone who was a segregationist. Other feedback, other reactions.
Yeah, Jamal, I just wanted to ask if anybody that's listening has got any experience with people from different faith groups crossing racial lines to discuss these kinds of issues of reconciliation and atonement. And if that's been done in Omaha, if we can tap into some of that effort, if it's already been done, or can we work on that? Because I'm just not finding any of it. Very little. I think there's only one church I ran across that was intentionally integrated. I think Resurrection up in North Omaha, but I don't know that much about how that's gone.
Yeah.
Is that a Episcopalian?
Right. That church is not there anymore?
Oh, no, I was saying, I think there's an Episcopalian church, but that might be the name of it, that is integrated. That was I think, I don't know. I'm Episcopalian, and I know the Diocese of Diocese of Nebraska has something going called Sacred Ground, and it's a program you can do, and it's through Zoom, and it's very eye-opening, not just about it. It's African American, Native American, Asian American, just real, and it's probably mostly white older people who do it, but it really is opens people's eyes, and they do a lot of reading. And they did a trip, which I took, which was down through Memphis and Oxford, Mississippi, and Birmingham and Montgomery and Selma. They called it Roads and Monuments, a civil rights trip, and it was not all whites. There was at least 2 or 3 couples that were older African Americans. It was really interesting to get their perspective.
This is almost
Louise, I think it was the Resurrection on 30th Street.
Yeah,
That's the one,
I know
because I
some of-
went early in my learning all this, whatever. I went to something there and it was a mixed group, and I think that's what they were talking about, is what you just said.
Yeah,
Of working
Because I know some of the
for,
people that went belong
and
to that church.
and from the Catholic angle, I know that the clustering of parishes, it's called family parishes. And in that book of Marcoux, it really shows the effort to have them separate worshipers. So Benedict the Moor Church got set up, and then Sacred Heart could be white and Benedict the Moor black. But what's happening now is that those are partnered as a family, and the pastor is the same person, Father David Korth. So they're working across the streets there, since they're kind of close to each other. So that's one effort I know about in the Catholic churches.
We're down to about the last 5 minutes or so, and Paul, I want to give you a chance. Any other closing comments or things before we get to that? We want to make a couple of shameless plugs. We're going to have a discussion on next Wednesday with the Inspector General for Child Welfare, the Ombudsman, and as well as the corrections at the Fabric Lab at 24th and Lake. And so we're kind of excited. They're coming out, the Trinities, I like to say. Some people don't like that term here, but they're going to talk about some of the issues going on in Nebraska. So we want people to participate. We will not be putting that Facebook Live, but it would be an opportunity to hear these three individuals who deal with issues in Lincoln. And also we've been trying to get them to do more issues with North and South Omaha and deal with racial groups. So we invite people to participate in that. The other thing that's going to be exciting, we're going to have Tom Riley, who is a public defender, come and talk at North Star in a couple of weeks or so in October. So we're kind of excited about that. And that'll be an in-person meeting also. And then I think on the 18th, Tom, I think is the 12th in October. And then the 18th, we're going to have a book discussion that deals with this issue of redistribution of wealth from a donor perspective. And so we're going to discuss that book. And so all this information is on our Facebook and as well as our Zoom, our website. So we'd ask you to go there and sign up. And so we'd like to increase our numbers and get more people involved in these activities. But at this point, I want to give Paul an opportunity if there's any closing comments, anything he want to share with our participants and things they could do to be more involved in this whole concept and issue of reparations and reconciliation. So, Paul, any closing comments?
Yeah, I just appreciate the chance to talk with people, and I think that building personal relationships with people in North Omaha, African Americans, between white and black people, to get to know each other personally. And I think the churches is an ideal opportunity to do that. The values are there. And it just hasn't been done. And I think building it on that lays the groundwork for looking at empathy and looking at restitution and reconciliation that needs to happen to rebuild the damage that's been done to the North Omaha community. You can't underestimate or overstate the amount of trauma that's happened to North Omaha at the hands of the white race in Omaha. It's just, but it's only going to change if people become personally engaged in that. So anything you can do, I think when we have that movie showing, that'll be a great opportunity, because it shows exactly that process of trying to engage people from a different racial group. And then maybe from there, we can build on that with other organizations and really expand on that and address racism in Omaha.
So on that note, Paul, I really appreciate Paul Feilmann to being here today and sharing with us some of his activities and working on, and hopefully we can increase the bandwidth of other folks in our community to do that, and particularly those who have some time on their hand to help deal with healing and reconciliation and conversations as we build the social capital across these various chasms and bridges in our society. So really appreciate you being here, Paul, and hopefully we'll have you back again to kind of talk about some of the other activities you're working on. We hope you've enjoyed this segment and what we do and throwing down some heavy light. And we have some other upcoming events for later this year. And also we're planning for 2024 to bring more and more folks in our circle, and particularly some of our international issues of dealing with Africa and Southern Africa. The Salelo, our program there, will talk more about how do you deal with reconciliation and healing as it relates to apartheid in South Africa and how it relates to our apartheid here in Omaha. So we hope you've enjoyed this edition. Join us again next time, as we always end. May the force be with you. Baroko.